One of the most telling lines someone can say that really gets on my nerves is, "I don't usually like horror, but I loved this A24 movie," because they're often going to say it with this weird holier-than-thou approach. Sometime in the mid-2010s, horror got a bit of an overhaul. Suddenly, movies like The Babadook, Hereditary, and Get Out weren't just scary, they were elevated, or smart horror. And listen, I love those movies deeply, but the way people talk about them sometimes makes me twitch a little in my seat, and it's led to the term elevated horror being one of my least favourite things out there. This idea that horror needs to be about trauma, grief, or feature some high concept metaphor in order to be taken seriously, that it needs to be elevated above the genre it resides in, kinda misses the whole point. And worse, it casts this looming shadow over everything that doesn't fit that mold. Like, if a horror movie isn't slow, tragic, and metaphor heavy, suddenly it's less valid to some people. Now, before we go any further, I want to make it clear that this video isn't a takedown of A24 or any other production company that specialises in the movies that fit this bill. This video isn't made to be a quality argument. I'm not here to say elevated horror is bad, I'm saying that I don't like the terminology, because it creates this hierarchy through an unspoken judgment, and it also says a lot about how we treat horror as a genre to begin with. So with that being said, welcome back to the bloody world of horror that I love speaking about. So, where did elevated horror actually come from? Well, like most of the genre buzzwords out there, it didn't just appear overnight. The early 2010s gave us a slow shift in the horror landscape. This weird moment where studios decided to start taking creative risks on stories that felt less like popcorn screamfests and more like studies on grief, trauma, and existential dread. Think of something like The Babadook in 2014, or It Follows in 2015, and The Witch in 2016. On top of being horror movies, these almost acted like statements for what the genre could and ultimately would become. And then in 2017, Get Out blew the door from the wall. It was a horror hit that was also now an Academy Award nominee. Suddenly, horror seemed to be hit with this rushing expansion. Now people who would typically ignore it viewed it as respectable in certain circumstances. Journalists and marketers needed a new label, and with that, elevated horror became the go-to phrase. Here's the thing, most of these movies are incredible. They do bring fresh ideas, unique voices, layered themes, and artistic ambition to the genre. That much isn't really up for debate, and I'm not going to try to. But what is worth examining is the label itself, and how it frames these films as something above horror, rather than simply being a part of it. It feels like it was something invented so certain people could look at a movie and think, don't worry, this horror movie is smarter than the others, you can like it without shame. And that's where the issue begins to creep in. Because while the term might have started as a compliment, a way to elevate the genre in the eyes of the mainstream audiences, it quickly became this weird kind of gatekeeping. If something was elevated, it was worth your time. If it wasn't, well, maybe that was just lowbrow horror, and that's ultimately where it loses me. Horror has never been lowbrow in the way these people intend it to mean. It's always been something that in some way would reflect the cultures, fears, and the collective anxieties of its time. It doesn't matter if it's doing it through a creepy slow burn or a blood-soaked slasher, horror has always had something to say. I want to try and pull back the curtain on a term that's been quietly reshaping how people see horror. Because words matter, and when we start building hierarchies within a genre that thrives on freedom, chaos, and transgression, we risk losing sight of what actually made it great in the first place. Okay, let's try and really define this thing. Usually people will use the term to describe horror that's slower paced, thematically rich, and metaphor driven. It's horror designed to make you think. It's grief as a ghost in The Babadook, generational trauma as a curse in Hereditary, racism as a literal trap in Get Out. These films use the horror to say something bigger, emotional, political, even philosophical at times. And again, that's not a bad thing. Actually, it's a big part of why so many of these movies are able to land half as hard as they do. But the catch for me often is that horror has always been metaphorical. Night of the Living Dead has been interpreted by many as a commentary on race. Alien is a film that many people see as one with strong feminist views. Candyman was a story about gentrification and systemic violence long before elevated horror was a buzzword being thrown at every bold new idea. Because these ideas aren't actually new, they're just being repackaged with a more minimalist art house shell. So really, what people are often praising isn't the intelligence of the horror, it's the aesthetic, the tone, the stillness, and the vibe. This is where the line gets real blurry for me, because if elevated horror is just a style, then what are we really praising? Is it the craft, or is it the content? Worse is, the more we use this label, the more we start acting like horror needs to earn respect. Like it has to dress itself up and whisper its trauma to be considered worthy of any analysis. In truth, the genre doesn't need to prove anything. It's been smart, emotional, provocative and political since the very beginning, regardless of art house slow burns or chainsaws and gore. So when someone says, I liked it because it was elevated, what they're really saying is, this horror movie looked and sounded like the kind of movie I'm already used to respecting. And that's not a reflection on the genre, that's a reflection on the person. Here's the main problem with the concept. It's quietly telling you that everything else is beneath it. It doesn't matter if that's the intention because the implication is baked into the term. Elevated means above, and that means something else has to be below. And when that mindset starts to spread, it creates a hierarchy where films like The Witch and Hereditary will sit at the top, while everything that's louder, messier, or filled with a certain horror pulp gets pushed into the basement. But lucky for us basement dwellers, that's where most of the fun is. The idea that horror has to be serious to be smart is such a limited view of what the genre can do. Like, are we really going to pretend that Final Destination isn't genius in its own special way? That Scream didn't reshape the genre by being self-aware and perfectly balanced between tension and comedic relief? That something like Barbarian, which swerves through tones like crazy, isn't just as inventive as the serious stuff? This is what happens when we let a label become a value judgment. We start seeing people dismiss these incredible films just because they don't feel elevated. You get horror fans feeling like they have to defend the things they love, and you get critics treating certain films like they're worth studying while others are nothing more than guilty pleasures. But here's the honest truth, at least in my opinion. There is no guilty horror, there's just horror.
What the hell?
The genre doesn't need to climb some artistic ladder to matter. It doesn't need to be wrapped in metaphors or grief to be meaningful. Sometimes it's meaningful because it makes you laugh or scream or squirm, because it dares to be weird or gross or delightfully stupid, because it knows exactly what it is and it leans into it unapologetically. This label doesn't just misrepresent the genre, but it limits how we can talk about it. It implies that horror is only valuable when it disguises itself as something else, as if we're still ashamed of the genre, trying to smuggle it past the gates of legitimacy in a trench coat and glasses. But horror isn't trying to sneak in anymore, it's already here and it has been for a long time. Before we bring out the machetes or the layered metaphors, let's talk about what horror actually does, because the genre is about transformation. Sometimes physically with people turning into monsters or creatures crawling out of mirrors, and sometimes in the emotional sense with the internal becoming external. Horror takes our grief, our shame, our rage, our loneliness and gives it form. When people say a horror movie isn't really scary, what that often means is that it didn't scare them in a way they expected. But fear isn't linear and it's not something that affects everyone in the same way. For some, it's a killer with a knife, and for others, it's the quiet horror of an empty room, a flicker in the corner, a feeling that something's wrong, even when nothing's happening. And horror understands that, giving space for both the loud and the quiet. That's why the Babadook doesn't need to explain the monster past the premise. That's why The Descent works just as well as a claustrophobic survival horror as it does a metaphor for unresolved trauma. Horror speaks in metaphor, but it never stops trying to hit you in the gut, and maybe that's what we're responding to when we call something elevated. Not the aesthetic or the slow pacing, but the emotional weight, the ache behind the terror. The way these films understand that fear is a symptom and not just a scream. That's not exclusive to the so-called elevated stuff though, it's everywhere. It's in The Fly, where body horror becomes a metaphor for illness and decay. It's in Ginger Snaps, which tackles female adolescence through lycanthropy. It's even in fucking Final Destination, of all things, where the inevitability of death is stylized through a bizarrely comedic nightmare of fate. The genre has always come with this sort of duality between the ridiculously brutal and the profoundly intimate. You can tell a deeply personal story about grief, or you can make something so purely absurd and fun, and both are valid, both belong. Horror is one of the most powerful tools in storytelling. It doesn't just exist to scare us, and it doesn't matter what it looks like on the outside. What matters is what it connects to, and what it lets out. Because the genre is an exorcism of emotion, and sometimes that's all we ever need from it. I love horror that makes me think. I love horror that makes me feel. And I also love horror that makes me scream, laugh, or question what the fuck I'm watching sometimes. At its core, it's never been a genre for playing by the rules, and it doesn't care if it's labelled as cinema or garbage. It doesn't require your permission to be absurd, and honestly, some of the movies that have stuck with me the longest are the ones that shouldn't really work on paper, but they do in the end because they commit to that stance. Look at something like Malignant, where the third act comes with a plot twist that turns the movie into a full-blown action set piece with this chaotic camera work and choreography. I fucking love this thing. Or The Exorcist Believer. It's messy and it's flawed as hell, and maybe it shouldn't have been part of this franchise, but I'll be the controversial one, as I tended to be. I liked it. Horror doesn't need to justify itself with metaphors to matter. It doesn't need to go through a ton of extra steps to be taken seriously. Sometimes it just needs the core mechanics that kept the genre alive for so long, and this isn't to say that those extra steps don't create good times either. There's a real power in that chaos, and if we start dividing the genre into real horror and guilty pleasures, we lose what makes it feel alive. Horror thrives on freedom, on experimentation, on the ability to be ugly and beautiful, profound and profoundly dumb, sometimes in the same movie. It doesn't need to be labelled to be meaningful. It doesn't need to be elevated to be great. It just needs to connect, to hit, to haunt you, thrill you, and sometimes maybe even mess you up a little bit. That for me is the magic of the genre. That for me is the whole point. That's why I love most of it. The smart, the silly, and everything in between. The A24s and the straight-to-streamings. Horror is a playground for people with creative voices, and the second we start putting up a fence that separates some from the others, we forget what makes it so damn great in the first place, and it's the originality. So forget the label, because horror is horror, and that's always been enough.